Never worry that you are not good enough. Once you are embraced by your true family, even your quietest inner thoughts will be treated like a radar that protects the ones you love. On the very first day that your wealthy older sister, Sarah Miller, brought you home, you walked into a dramatic scene. Your second sister, Jessica, was kneeling on the floor with her two-faced boyfriend, Brandon Vance, begging your grandfather to give his blessing. The two of them were clutching each other and sobbing as if their world was ending. Your grandfather, Thomas Miller, looked like he was finally starting to cave in and was about to say yes. At that exact moment, the entire family suddenly heard your inner thoughts. You were thinking about how pathetic Jessica was because even though Brandon never asked for cash, he was still as greedy as they come. Every time he wanted a new toy, he would post about it on Facebook and set the privacy so only Jessica could see it. The poor girl never suspected a thing and would always find an excuse to buy it for him, like it was a total coincidence. My sister Jessica is great in many ways, but she clearly was not born with a full deck of cards. She worships this guy like he is some legendary first love. But to him, she is nothing more than a backup bank account. As soon as he gets what he really wants, she will be the first person he kicks to the curb. Jessica's eyes widened in shock as she wondered what you meant by him kicking her to the curb or her being a backup. Thomas was also caught off guard and wondered what the hell was going on. He questioned if he was actually hearing the inner thoughts of the boy he just brought home. He kept a straight face and scanned the room, eventually locking eyes with Sarah. Sarah was his favorite, and she always knew exactly what he was thinking. They shared a silent look of mutual understanding that said everything. Sarah gave the old man a tiny nod because she was clearly on the same page. They decided to wait and see how the situation played out before making a move. You had no idea what was happening and only noticed that the vibe in the room had become incredibly tense and heavy. You could feel your new sister Jessica staring at you intently. You ignored it because you figured she was just curious about the brother she never knew she had. If anything, you actually felt sorry for her. Jessica looks like she has it all, but she is really just a pawn in someone else's game. The only reason Brandon came crawling back to her was because he had a massive blow-up with his actual girlfriend. He is just using Jessica to make his real girl jealous. Plus, Jessica is rich, naive, and gorgeous, making her the perfect consolation prize for him to play with. The second he makes up with his true love, he will toss Jessica aside like garbage. Jessica's calm facade began to crumble as she listened to your thoughts. She had to take a deep breath to steady herself. She would not even care if he was only after her money. She gripped Brandon's hand and looked her grandfather in the eye, arguing that Brandon had saved her life regardless of what anyone else thought. She claimed she would be dead if it wasn't for him and asked if that didn't matter more than anything else. Thomas let out a cold snort and wanted to tell her that the whole idea of marrying someone out of gratitude was an outdated cliché. He thought to himself that nobody fell for that kind of nonsense anymore. Before he could speak, your unfiltered thoughts rang out again, questioning when Brandon had ever actually saved Jessica's life. Thomas froze, and the old fox immediately realized something was fishy. He seized the opportunity to ask if she was talking about that shipwreck back in college when they were stranded on the island. Jessica was caught up in the drama, but she immediately understood where her grandfather was going. She confirmed that was the incident she meant. You started scanning your memories like a fast-forward movie until you suddenly figured it out. You realized that Jessica's experience on that island was absolutely horrific. Jessica's heart skipped a beat as she wondered what could possibly be so tragic about her story. You thought to yourself that Jessica deserved to know the truth. You remembered that during the shipwreck, Brandon was not the one who pushed her toward the shore. That loser could barely even save himself, and it was actually a dolphin that carried her to the beach. Jessica felt like she had been hit by a sledgehammer and was completely dazed. She tried to justify it by thinking that Brandon still stayed by her side and covered her with leaves to keep her warm. Your thoughts immediately shut that down by calling it total bullshit. He only covered her with those leaves because he was terrified she would die and rot, which might make him sick. He was just trying to create a makeshift barrier between him and a potential corpse. Jessica had survived that entire ordeal purely through her own will to live. By the time she finally woke up, Brandon just happened to be walking by and decided to play the hero since she was still alive. She was actually touched by his fake act and had spent years treating him like a first love while throwing money at him. You thought she would be better off donating that money to a dolphin rescue foundation instead. The foyer fell into a deathly silence. Brandon had no idea why the Miller family was suddenly acting so strange, but he assumed things were going his way. Brandon tried to act romantic by telling Jessica how happy he was that her family accepted them. Jessica suddenly interrupted him and asked if he remembered seeing a dolphin in the water that day. The question caught Brandon off guard and made his heart race. He wondered why she was bringing this up now and told her she must be mistaken because he didn't remember any dolphin. Brandon tried to look calm, but his brief moment of panic gave him away instantly. Jessica's expression hardened and her voice became cold enough to freeze water. She demanded to know why he was lying to her. She told him that she remembered everything now and realized she had been alone on that beach the entire time. He hadn't saved her at all. You were shocked and wondered how Jessica's brain had suddenly started working again. You were screaming in your head so loud that it nearly overwhelmed Jessica's own thoughts. Brandon opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. His silence was basically a full confession. Every last bit of hope Jessica had for him was gone. Jessica dismissively told him to get out and that they were over. She warned him never to contact her again. Brandon's face turned a deep shade of crimson. He never imagined the lie he had maintained for years would be dismantled in front of the entire family. Unable to handle their judging stares, he turned and fled the house in total humiliation. Jessica watched him run away and lowered her head, looking completely devastated. You sent out a comforting thought, telling her not to be sad. Jessica looked up at you and felt a pang of emotion. She realized you were the brother she just met, even if you had just destroyed her romantic fantasy. You thought to yourself that even if she failed 99 times, she should try 100th time just to keep the numbers even. Then again, you thought it would be better if she just spent the 100th time beating the hell out of that jerk. Jessica was so annoyed she could have screamed. Thomas squeezed his eyes shut and told himself not to laugh, trying his best to keep the corners of his mouth from twitching. He cleared his throat because he knew he would be the one dealing with it if Jessica actually passed out. He looked at you and told you to come over, calling you by name. You finally snapped out of it and remembered you were there for a family reunion. You jogged over and introduced yourself to your grandfather, who gave you a small nod. After decades of ruthless business deals, Thomas had become a man of few words. He was actually quite nervous about suddenly having a grandson and had no idea how to act around you. He decided to follow the advice he found on Google, which said the first step was to provide financial security so you wouldn't have to worry about money. He tapped his cane on the floor as he made his decision. He was never one to waste time and got straight to the point. He welcomed you to the Miller family and told you that you would need to learn the house rules now that you were home. As he read through the rules, you thought to yourself that it felt more like a school assembly than a homecoming. You wondered if he forgot he was a CEO and not a high school principal. You worried that you were going to end up falling asleep during board meetings if things were always this dull. Thomas glanced at you from under his heavy eyelids. He saw you sitting there looking attentive and assumed you were listening, so he kept reading his prepared speech. He had no idea that your mind was already miles away because you were bored. You started studying his appearance and eventually noticed a pale old scar on the back of his left hand. You thought about how old people can look so stern and cold, even though they were probably passionate warriors for love in their youth. When that thought crossed your mind, Sarah and Jessica both stopped in their tracks as they tried to sneak out of the room. They both pulled their feet back and tried to act like they weren't doing anything wrong. You didn't even notice the look Thomas was giving you because you were too busy imagining his past. You imagined your grandfather as a young man from a small town who was madly in love with your grandmother. On her birthday, he was out working in the fields when he decided he wanted to do something romantic for her. He picked a huge bouquet of wildflowers to surprise her, but he never expected what happened next. Suddenly, your grandfather interrupted your thoughts by announcing he was giving you $5 million to spend however you liked. Thomas raised his voice to get your attention, and the mention of $5 million made your eyes light up like dollar signs. You told him he wasn't just your grandfather. He was a legend. Thomas kept a calm expression, but he was actually breaking out in a cold sweat. He was relieved he had managed to stop you before you could spill any more of his secrets. Sarah and Jessica just watched the two of you with very confused expressions. They were frustrated that the story had stopped right at the good part. Jessica joked that $5 million was nothing for a family like theirs. She told you it was embarrassing to be bought for such a small amount and that they needed to show you what real wealth looked like. Thomas had successfully used the money to distract you and keep you from digging up any more of his old embarrassing stories. The old man was genuinely puzzled about how you knew so much about his past, especially those tiny details from decades ago. He had a love-hate relationship with your uncanny ability to read him. He decided to focus on the parenting guide he had put together after spending hours on Google. He had written everything down in a small notebook. The second rule in his book said that after giving a boy money, he should immediately be introduced to high-status women. He wanted to make sure you had high standards, so you wouldn't fall for the first girl who showed you any attention. He figured today was the perfect day to start. Thomas looked at his eldest granddaughter, Sarah, and told her to take you to the office with her that afternoon. Sarah was already planning on showing you the ropes at the company, so she agreed immediately. She asked if you wanted to stay home or head into the office with her. You thought to yourself that they were already planning out your entire life for you. Still, you decided that for $5 million, you were happy to follow their lead. You were ready to do whatever they asked and told them you would go with Sarah. You gave a polite nod. Sarah looked at you with suspicion and wondered if you had a split personality. You went from being a sarcastic critic in your head to a perfectly obedient brother in a split second. Jessica had to stay behind because Thomas wanted to give her a serious lecture about her life choices. As you were leaving, Sarah asked why you were staring at their grandfather's hand earlier. You gave her an innocent look and told her you were just curious about the scar on his hand. You started thinking about the story again and remembered how your grandfather was planning a romantic confession with that bouquet of wildflowers. Just as they were about to share a romantic moment, he stepped in some chicken droppings and slipped. He ended up rolling all the way down a hill and landed right in the middle of a cow pen. He landed face first in a pile of manure, and that was how he actually cut his hand. Sarah tried her best to stay serious, but she eventually lost it and started laughing. Thomas was mortified to be exposed like that, and his face turned bright red. He gave them a sharp look and made a mental note to get back at them later. He thought to himself that they would eventually pay for laughing at him. He didn't think much of you since you were only 14 years old. He realized that while you were the one thinking these things, your sisters were the ones actually laughing. You sneezed as Sarah started the car and began driving you toward the office. You found the silence awkward, so you decided to ask her about the size of their company. Sarah acted like it was no big deal and told you that the company was a decent size with slightly above average revenue. She told you that when you started dating, you should at least find a girl from a family with a company of a similar size. She made it sound like a very modest request. The car pulled up in front of a massive skyscraper. You leaned your head back as far as it would go, but you still couldn't see the top of the building. You couldn't believe she called this an average company. You thought to yourself that if these were her standards, she was probably going to end up alone. She heard your thought loud and clear. Sarah raised an eyebrow and gave you a playful tap on the head as she told you to get inside. The entire top floor was dedicated to the executive suite. Sarah sat down at her desk and got straight to work. She told you she had a video call and that you should wait for a bit. She promised to give you a tour of the building once she was finished. You tried listening to the meeting for a few minutes, but it was incredibly dull. You soon gave up and found yourself staring at Sarah while she worked. She looked so elegant and composed while she was focused on her business. You couldn't help but start thinking to yourself again. As she typed away on her keyboard, you found yourself thinking about how beautiful she was. Sarah heard your genuine compliment and couldn't help but smile. She was used to people flattering her, but hearing it from you felt different. She knew most people only complimented her for personal gain, but she could tell you really meant it. It made the compliment feel much more meaningful. A few minutes later, she heard another one of your thoughts, and this one was much more alarming. You were thinking about what a shame it was that such a beautiful woman was about to be framed and sent to prison. You thought about how her most trusted secretary was secretly working with her rivals to set her up for financial crimes. According to your thoughts, the secretary had been cooking the books for years and hiding it so well that nobody noticed. You wondered how you could possibly warn her without sounding like a total weirdo. You worried that speaking up would be suspicious since you knew nothing about the business. Still, you couldn't just stand by and watch your sister go to jail. Sarah's expression immediately went cold, and she slammed her coffee down on the table. You jumped in your seat and looked at her in surprise. The financial director had just walked in, and he nearly jumped out of his skin when he heard the noise. He nervously asked if something was wrong, and Sarah told him she had just realized she hadn't audited the books herself in a very long time. Her voice was sharp and commanding. She ordered him to have all the financial records from the last few years sent to her office immediately. He was completely confused, but he didn't dare to ask any questions. He hurried out of the room to follow her orders. You were left wondering why she had suddenly decided to look at the books. You wondered if the director had said something to tip her off. In reality, it was all because she could hear your thoughts. It was going to take at least a day to gather all those records together. Sarah stood up and told you she was going to give you a tour of the office. She also wanted to see if she could figure out which of her secretaries was the traitor. As you were headed for the elevator, you ran into a man in a sharp blue suit. He had a look that was somewhere between clever and naive. He looked like a recent grad, trying his best to act like an experienced professional. It was her assistant, Leo Wright, and he was there to drop off some files. He looked surprised to see her and immediately straightened his tie. Sarah just told him to leave the files on her desk. You thought to yourself that he looked familiar, and Sarah noticed you were studying Leo intently. Sarah's brow furrowed slightly as she thought about Leo. He was an orphan that the Miller family had been supporting since her grandfather was in charge. She had continued to support him through college and even paid for him to study abroad. She had hired him as soon as he graduated, hoping to make him her right-hand man. She wondered if he was the one who was supposed to betray her, but the timeline didn't seem to make sense. A dozen different theories flashed through her mind in a matter of seconds. She brushed those thoughts aside and introduced the two of you. Leo gave you a nervous greeting and called you sir. You weren't intimidated and gave him a polite reply. Leo assumed you were just another spoiled rich kid. He had no idea that your mind was racing a mile a minute. You recognized the name Leo Wright as the legendary assistant who would eventually become famous for his loyalty and skills. You remembered that he was the one who would help Sarah rebuild her empire and get revenge after she got out of prison. Looking at him now, he just seemed like an innocent puppy, which was a huge contrast to the legendary figure he would become. You wondered if he had some kind of extreme plastic surgery in the future, because the transformation was so hard to believe. Sarah was completely taken aback by your thoughts. She hadn't actually been to prison, but thinking about how hard her life would be if she did made her shiver. She realized that if your thoughts were true, Leo would be the only person who stayed loyal to her when everything went wrong. You thought about how tragic his ending was going to be. According to your memories, Sarah would get sick in prison and die before she could finish her revenge. Leo would be left with nobody and eventually snap after being pushed too far. He would end up killing himself and the main villain in a final act of desperation. He would literally burn his own life away just to take down his enemies. You looked at Leo's young, innocent face and felt a wave of sympathy for him. You thought to yourself that the Miller family should never mistreat someone as loyal as him. You started imagining his life story as a grand, tragic epic. Even after Sarah's sudden death, he had dedicated his entire life to her cause and stayed loyal until the very end. You mentally thanked him for his sacrifice and wished him well. Sarah felt a massive headache coming on as she listened to all this. She wondered if you were just overly dramatic, but she decided that if your predictions were right, she needed to keep Leo close. She softened her tone and invited Leo to join the two of you for a tour of the office. Leo was surprised and thrilled to be invited. He knew that normally a task like this would be given to Sarah, the head secretary. The Miller Group was a massive conglomerate with many different divisions. Sarah first took you to the legal department to show you how the top lawyers operated. Then she took you to the fashion department so you could see the latest trends. Every manager who greeted you seemed to be accompanied by a very attractive assistant. You spent the entire day surrounded by beautiful people. By the end of the tour, you felt less like a new sibling and more like a judge at a beauty pageant. The tour finally ended, and you headed back to her office. As you walked in, you saw a woman who looked perfectly innocent standing by the sofa. She gave Sarah a warm smile and handed her a folder. She told Sarah the plans for the Golden Bay project were ready and only needed her signature to start the funding. Sarah took the pen and was about to sign when your inner voice started screaming at her. You were looking out the window, but in your head, you were shouting for her to stop. You almost lunged for the folder, but she was much faster than you. She suddenly snatched the document and tossed it right out of the window. She didn't say a word and headed straight for the bathroom to wash her hands. Everyone in the room was completely speechless. You pulled your hand back as she walked back into the room. She calmly dried her hands and told everyone she had seen a bug on the folder and that it was just a reflex because she was afraid of insects. Sarah seemed relieved and gave her a fake smile. She offered to print another copy and said she would have someone go downstairs to retrieve the original. She was trying to pressure Sarah into signing while acting perfectly professional. You thought to yourself that she was a total snake and a traitor. You thought about how she was pretending to care about Sarah while secretly working for the competition. You knew the Golden Bay project was a total disaster because the land was worthless. Your plan was to wait until all the money was spent before leaking the fake accounts and blaming Sarah for the failure. She was going to let Sarah take the fall while she walked away clean. You were furious that she could betray someone who had trusted her for so long. You thought she was absolute trash. You remembered that the Golden Bay scandal was what eventually led to the downfall of the Miller family. Sarah was stunned as she looked at Sarah. She had never once suspected her friend of being a traitor. They had been friends since high school, and Sarah had spent years helping her out financially. She had hired her right after college and had been grooming her for a top position. She couldn't believe her kindness was being repaid with betrayal. Sarah's expression darkened as she felt a wave of anger. Strangely enough, your thoughts seemed even more furious about the betrayal than she was. You sighed in your head about how your naive sister still had no idea what was going on. You remembered that Sarah had only friends Sarah in high school because she had an ulterior motive. It turned out she was the illegitimate daughter of the CEO of the Davis Corporation. Her father had cheated on his wife and had a secret child with his mistress. She knew she would never be accepted by her father's legitimate family, so she decided to use Sarah to gain power for herself. You suddenly realized that Sarah was actually the woman Brandon was currently obsessed with. You wondered if the two of them were already working together. Jessica's ears perked up the second she heard Brandon's name. She was shocked that Brandon was involved in this too. You figured they had probably made up by now. To Sarah, Brandon was just a useful pawn. Even if Jessica was finished with him, he still had enough dirt on Sarah to keep her in line. He had used his relationship with Jessica to get into the building so he could help Sarah steal confidential files. They were both in this together, and if one of them went down, the other was going with them. Sarah decided she would have Leo look into the matter as soon as possible. Sarah had no idea that her entire life story had been exposed in just a few minutes. She walked back into the room with a fresh copy of the document and a fake smile on her face. She told Sarah the papers were ready for her signature. Sarah barely looked at them before heading back to her desk and sitting down. Sarah tried to pressure her by saying that other companies were interested in the project and that they couldn't afford to wait. Sarah started to panic when she saw that Sarah didn't seem to care. She had spent years setting this trap, and all she needed was one signature to finish it. Everything was going perfectly until now. She couldn't understand why Sarah had suddenly changed her mind in the few minutes it took to print a new copy. Sarah took a sip of her coffee and calmly told Sarah that if another company took the project, it just wasn't meant to be. She acted like she wasn't worried at all. Sarah tried again by claiming she had already promised the partners the paperwork would be ready today. She argued that backing out now would damage the company's reputation. Sarah set her coffee cup down on the desk. She told Sarah to just tell the partners that she had found out her boyfriend was cheating and had to deal with the situation immediately. You laughed to yourself and thought that Sarah was being absolutely ruthless. Sarah tried to act like it was a joke, but Sarah's voice suddenly turned cold. She asked Sarah how long they had been friends. The sudden change in tone terrified Sarah. She stammered that it had been almost 10 years. Sarah looked out at the city lights and noted that 10 years was a long time. She said it was long enough for things to change and for her to realize she might have been wrong about everything from the start. Sarah felt a pit in her stomach as she wondered what Sarah meant. You watched Sarah and noticed she looked perfectly calm and in control. Sarah calmly told her there was no rush and that she would look at the papers later. She pointed out that the official bidding wasn't until the day after tomorrow. Sarah agreed, but her mind was racing. She was too scared to keep pushing for the signature. Sarah watched her leave with a dark expression. She decided that if the audit proved Sarah was a thief, she would show no mercy. She didn't want to just send her to prison because that was too easy. She wanted to make sure Sarah's life on the outside was a living hell. Later that evening, Sarah told Thomas everything that had happened at the office. The financial director had spent the night going through the records and found that $10 million were missing. It looked like the deputy director of finance was involved too. Thomas was furious that someone so close to Sarah could be so corrupt. He felt a sense of relief that he had decided to send you to the office with her today. He knew that if things had gone the way they were supposed to, the family would never have survived the scandal. He realized he owed you a huge debt of gratitude. Just as he was thinking this, he heard your thoughts racing again. You were thinking about how much you hated studying and how you wanted to just drop out of school. You thought it would be much easier to just find a wealthy woman to take care of you. Thomas rubbed his temples and felt another headache coming on. He wondered what was wrong with you and why you were thinking such ridiculous things. He was annoyed that you were looking for a sugar mama when the family already had more money than you could ever spend. You were in your room on the same floor, pulling your hair out over your homework. You eventually gave up and decided you would just finish it at school tomorrow. You crawled into bed and slept soundly until the sun came up without a single worry. You were dragged out of bed the next morning before the sun was even up. You looked completely miserable and thought to yourself that life was pointless. You thought waking up at 6 a.m. was a crime against humanity. You weakly ate a breakfast burrito while you got ready. Thomas told you to stop complaining and handed you a glass of milk. He reminded you that your sister Maya went to the same school and told you to find her if you needed anything. You just sat there eating while your mind was blank. In reality, your sister Maya was sitting right across from you, and she was already furious. Thomas was frustrated that you had stopped your inner monologue halfway. He was about to try and trick you into finishing the story when the driver came in to tell you it was time to go. You said you were coming. Thomas wanted to grab you and demand answers, but he managed to control himself. He watched you run out the door with your backpack. Just as the door closed, Sarah walked into the kitchen for breakfast. Thomas called out to her and told her to contact Maya immediately. He wanted to make sure Maya kept a close eye on you all day. 30 minutes later, you arrived at Northwood Academy, the most prestigious private school in the area. Most of the students at Northwood came from incredibly wealthy and powerful families. Parents would do anything to get their kids into the school. People knew that making the right connections here would set a kid up for life. The driver offered to help you carry your bags inside because they looked heavy. You politely declined and told him you could handle it. As you lifted your bag, there was a loud metallic clanking sound. You and the driver shared an awkward look for a moment. He asked if your racket was broken and offered to buy you a new one. You quickly told him that it wasn't necessary and that you were fine. You turned and ran into the school as fast as you could. Once you were inside, you unzipped the bag and let out a sigh of relief. You didn't have a racket in there at all. It was a heavy steel pipe. You knew that once people found out you had been disowned by your old family, they would turn on you in an instant. You suspected your former adopted brother was behind it. You had humiliated them yesterday, and you knew their retaliation would be brutal. You thought about the graffiti they used to leave on your desk, and the time they almost jumped you. You felt a surge of adrenaline and decided that today, you were the one doing the hunting. You walked into your classroom and saw that some other guy was already sitting in your old seat in the front row. You weren't surprised and just walked straight to the back of the room and sat in a corner next to a trash can. Someone had painted the word trash on your new desk in bright red paint. To your surprise, there was already a girl sitting there. She was hiding her face behind a book and had her feet up on the desk. You raised an eyebrow and wondered what kind of game they were playing now. The room was deathly quiet as everyone watched to see what you would do. The girl slowly lowered her book and looked at you. She calmly told you that you were back. Before she could finish her sentence, you swung the steel pipe right past her head. You looked her in the eye and told her that she was either going to get you a new desk or she wasn't leaving the room. You finally got a good look at her face and nearly lost it. You realized the girl was actually your sister, Maya, and you had no idea why she was in your seat. Maya was in shock as she looked at you. She wondered if you were the same sweet brother Sarah had described on the phone, because you currently looked like a total psychopath. Before she could say anything, she heard your inner voice in her head. She realized that she was now able to hear your thoughts too. She decided to roll with it and put on her toughest expression. She asked if you had anything to say to your big sister, since it was your first time meeting. You were about to speak when you heard a loud crash as someone knocked over some furniture. You thought to yourself that your sister really knew how to make an entrance. Northwood was a boarding school, and Maya had been asleep in her dorm until Sarah called. Sarah had ordered her to go meet her long-lost brother immediately. Sarah had threatened to cancel all her credit cards if she didn't go. Maya didn't have a choice but to listen. She only planned to stay for a minute, but she changed her mind when she saw the graffiti on your desk and heard the nasty rumors people were spreading. Maya was livid. She didn't care what people said about her, but she wasn't about to let anyone mess with a member of the Miller family. Maya was already a legend at Northwood, and everyone knew her as the queen of the school. Her family's reputation was so intimidating that most people were too scared to even look at her the wrong way. She demanded to know who was responsible for the graffiti as she scanned the room with a cold stare. The room went silent as everyone looked at her in confusion. They couldn't understand why she was getting involved. She announced to the class that you were her brother and that she would be protecting you from now on. She warned everyone to think twice before they tried anything. She noted that she didn't care if the culprits confessed or not. She said that once you arrived, she would let you identify them yourself. The kids who were involved looked terrified. Everyone else was just in total shock. They couldn't believe it because they thought you were just some poor kid who had been disowned. They were confused as to how Maya Miller could possibly be your sister. The story they had been told was completely different from what was happening. Maya ignored the gossip and just sat there. She put her feet back up and covered her face with her book again. She imagined you walking in and looking at her with total admiration. Instead, the first thing she heard was you threatening someone with a steel pipe. It was definitely not the reaction she was expecting. She cleared her throat and tried to act like the cool older sister again. She asked if you had anything to say to her. She thought she sounded cool, but then she heard you thinking about how intense she was. You realized you had just threatened your own sister with a pipe. You quickly put the pipe away and gave her a sweet smile. You awkwardly introduced yourself and offered her the steel pipe as a gift. Maya casually handed the pipe to one of her followers and told you to point out the people who had been bullying you. You decided to take her up on the offer and walked over to a boy in the front row. You put your hand on his shoulder. Mark looked incredibly guilty, and he wasn't doing a very good job of hiding it. You tried to act friendly, but you got straight to the point. You asked him if he was the one who wrote the graffiti on your desk. Mark was a typical bully who only picked on people he thought were weaker than him. He thought that being poor was a reason to humiliate someone. He used to spend all his time sucking up to the rich kids in class, including you when you were still a young master. You had always ignored him back then, and he had been holding a grudge ever since. As soon as he heard you were in trouble, he jumped at the chance to hurt you. He was also trying to suck up to your old family by making your life miserable. He desperately tried to deny it and claimed he hadn't even had the chance to write anything yet. You had never seen him act like this before. You weren't exactly friends, but you weren't enemies either. Maya crossed her arms and pointed toward the security camera at the front of the room. She asked if he wanted her to pull the footage from the camera right then and there. Mark's face went pale as he realized he was in trouble. He had assumed you were just a nobody who didn't have the power to get the footage. He didn't think the principal or the teachers would care enough about you to bother checking the cameras. He hadn't even tried to hide from the camera because he thought he was safe. Now, everything had changed in an instant. You gave him a sweet smile and told him there was no need to make it difficult. Your voice sounded friendly, but your words were brutal. You asked if anyone else in the room had seen what he did, and everyone immediately started shouting that they had. They told you they had seen him arrive early with paint and a mop. Everyone was pointing at him now. The accusations kept coming, and Mark started to panic. His voice went up an octave as he tried to defend himself. He tried to blame Fred and Victoria, but they weren't about to let him get away with it. They both jumped out of their seats to argue. They accused him of lying and reminded him that he was the one who was most excited to get revenge on you. They argued that they didn't know anything about the situation and that he was the one who came up with the whole plan. Mark tried to say he was only trying to help you, but nobody believed him. You just sat back and watched as the three of them started fighting with each other. Your teacher was standing in the doorway and had seen everything. He looked like he didn't know whether to walk in or just run away. The three students were now in a full-blown physical fight. It was a total mess of shouting and pushing. Maya watched the fight for a few moments before she turned to look at you. She worried that the fight was going to traumatize you. She figured you were probably already scarred for life. She remembered her orders to keep an eye on you and decided that class was over for the day. She decided she might as well just take you out of school and walked over to the teacher. She calmly told him that the Miller group wouldn't forget about this. She suggested he call the kids' parents and let the adults handle the situation. She pulled out her phone and sent a quick text to Sarah to tell her what happened. She told the teacher she was taking you with her and that you wouldn't be attending class for the rest of the day. The teacher immediately agreed because he was too scared to say no to her. You pulled on Maya's sleeve and asked if the two of you were headed home. Maya was so touched by you calling her sister that she almost started crying. She was used to being at the bottom of the family rankings. She tried to stay cool and told you that Sarah wanted her to keep an eye on you all day. She then asked you to call her sister again. You decided to play dumb because she had gone through so much trouble to help you. You asked her what she wanted you to call her, and she just told you to forget it. She said your hall pass was signed and that it was time to leave. Maya gave the slip to the teacher and walked out of the room. You followed her like a good little brother. You mentally cheered for her and called her Queen Maya. Even though she was trying to look tough, she couldn't help but smile. As you were leaving the middle school wing, Maya's best friend, Olivia, started telling you all about Maya's legendary exploits. She told you that your sister was a total genius despite never doing any work. She said Maya would sleep through class and party all night, but still got perfect grades. Olivia complained that Maya would only study for 3 days before an exam, but always ended up at the top of the class. You nodded your head and agreed that it was pretty insane. Maya was listening to your thoughts the whole time and heard you complaining that Olivia was wrong about her playing games all night. You knew she was actually up late with her headphones on, listening to college lectures online. You figured her sleeping in class was just a way to hide how hard she was working. You knew she was secretly doing hundreds of practice exams, even though she never did her regular homework. You thought her legendary 3-day study sessions were just the only times she actually felt comfortable studying in public. You thought her whole tough girl persona was just an act and that she was actually incredibly competitive. You kept nodding, and Olivia became even more excited to tell you more stories. She told you that Maya was also an incredible athlete who never failed a physical test. She told you about a school hiking trip where everyone else gave up, but Maya kept going until she reached the summit. Olivia thought she was a machine and noted that she even showed up to class the next day like it was nothing. She joked that you had probably never seen how exhausted Maya got after pulling an all-nighter. She said Maya would be so tired she could barely walk, but would still keep talking trash. Maya was breaking out in a cold sweat as she realized how much you knew about her. Sarah had replied to her text almost instantly, almost as if she had been waiting for the message. Sarah told her that she wasn't the only one who could hear your thoughts. It seemed like the entire family was affected by this strange ability. Sarah warned her to keep it a secret and told her to delete their entire conversation immediately. Neither of them could explain why you had this power, and they were both too scared to ask. Sarah joked that they should just treat you like an angel sent from heaven to save the family. Maya asked Sarah if she was actually being serious because she couldn't believe her sister was making jokes. Sarah told her that she would increase her allowance if she took good care of you, but warned her that there would be trouble if anything happened to you. Maya joked that you were acting more like the boss of the family than a new brother. Maya assumed Sarah was just being dramatic and screenshotted the conversation to show their grandfather. She wanted to get Sarah in trouble. Their grandfather replied with a single sentence, telling Maya that her sister was right. He told her to be nice to you, and Maya immediately closed the app after reading the first two sentences. She swore that she would never start sucking up to you like the rest of the family was doing. Someone whistled at her and asked if she was ready for the race tonight. The words sounded polite, but the tone was dripping with sarcasm. Maya and Olivia both looked annoyed as soon as they heard it. The girl leading the group had bleached blonde hair and looked like a total rebel. She mocked Maya for being missing and asked if she had gone soft and started working as a babysitter. Maya was about to snap back when she heard you making a sarcastic comment behind her. You asked if someone had lost their golden retriever because it wouldn't stop barking. You joked that she was only acting tough because she knew she was protected by animal rights laws. Maya burst out laughing and looked at the girl's blonde hair. She thought your comparison was perfect. The blonde girl, Riley Banks, touched her hair and demanded to know who you were. Maya stepped in front of you and told Riley to watch her mouth because you were her brother. Riley might have hated Maya, but she wasn't the type to bully a kid. She actually felt a little bad about what she said. She snorted and went back to mocking Maya. She asked her if she was ready for the bet and said she was worried Maya wouldn't pay up when she lost. Maya sneered and told her she hoped Riley would stay that confident once the race was over. Olivia asked you what was wrong, and Maya turned around to see you staring at Riley as she walked away. She realized that Riley was actually quite pretty and worried that you might have a crush on her. She was about to talk trash about Riley, but she heard you thinking about how gorgeous she looked in her younger years. You wondered if all these girls had surgery when they turned 17 because they looked so different from your memories. You remembered that Maya always talked about Riley as her absolute arch-nemesis. They used to fight every single day in school. You were surprised that Riley was actually such a cool punk rebel when she was younger. You shook your head as you watched her walk away. You thought to yourself that Riley would eventually be the one sucking up to Maya in the future when she became her benefactor. You thought the whole story was insane. You were imagining a future where the family went bankrupt and Maya's rival became her secret benefactor. Maya was absolutely stunned by what you were thinking. She was shocked to hear the family might go bankrupt. She was even more confused about Riley wanting to take care of her. She thought it was impossible because she was sure Riley wasn't interested in women like that. She couldn't understand how the story could possibly go in that direction. Maya was spinning from all the information, but you weren't done with the story yet. You started thinking about the main reason why Riley would do such a thing. Maya slowed down as soon as she heard that. She was desperate for you to finish the thought and tell her the secret. Unfortunately, Olivia sighed and distracted you before you could finish your thought. You asked her what was wrong, and she told you she was just worried about Maya. Maya was screaming in her head for Olivia to stop talking so she could hear what you were thinking. Maya was losing her mind, but neither of you had any idea. You thought about everything you had just heard, and suddenly something clicked in your mind. You asked what the bet was about, and Olivia looked at Maya, unsure if she should tell you. Maya acted like it was no big deal and told you they were having a motorcycle race on Mulholland Drive tonight. She joked it was a real-life version of Fast and Furious. She said the loser had to be the winner's assistant for a whole month. You thought to yourself that being an assistant was exactly what Riley would be doing for Maya in the future anyway. You told her that Mulholland Drive was dangerous and asked if they could race somewhere else. Maya just raised her eyebrows. She looked incredibly excited as soon as you mentioned racing. She gave you a wild, confident smile. She told you to trust her skills and claimed she could drive Mulholland with her eyes closed. She told you she would be fine and asked if you wanted to go home or head to her villa with her. Even though Northwood was a boarding school, they let the top students live off campus. Maya had bought a small villa near the school so she could study in private and keep her grades high. The place was fully furnished and her garage was packed with all her favorite motorcycles. You couldn't stop thinking about the race tonight, so you told her you would go to the villa. Maya had already cleared your absence with the school, so she led the way to her place. She immediately regretted it when she opened the front door because she had forgotten you were with her. You were staring at a wall covered in vocabulary flashcards. You You told her she was a lot more studious than she let on. You thought to yourself that people who act like they don't care are usually the ones working the hardest behind the scenes. You figured they just wanted everyone else to relax so they could pull ahead. You knew that if you believed her act, you would definitely lose. Maya thought about how Sarah and her grandfather had warned her to behave herself and be nice to you. She cleared her throat and told you to follow her example of being a good student. You walked over to her wall calendar with your hands behind your back. You were walking like an old man in a park. Maya almost wanted to hand you a cane because you looked so ridiculous. She had never really spent much time around boys, and she didn't know how to react to you. She thought that since you were both students, she might as well have you do some practice exams with her. She started imagining a sweet scene where she was helping you with your studies like a perfect older sister. You were staring at the calendar with a very serious expression. You had no idea what she was thinking. You checked your phone and realized that today was the day of Maya's race on Mulholland Drive. You remembered that today was the day Maya was supposed to have a terrible accident. You knew her tire was going to blow out during the race, and she would be severely injured. In your memories, she would be left with permanent damage to her legs and spend days in the ICU. She would never be able to exercise again. Maya was horrified by the thought of losing the use of her legs, and she took a step back. Your thoughts had completely destroyed her peace of mind. She tried to tell herself that it couldn't be true. She knew her bike was in perfect condition and that a tire blowout shouldn't be possible. She wondered if someone had sabotaged the track, but that would have affected everyone, not just her. She always checked her bike before a race, and she was sure there were no mechanical issues. You thought to yourself that someone had actually planted a small explosive inside her tire. Maya was terrified because she knew exactly what would happen if a tire blew while she was at top speed. She immediately started thinking about who could have done it. She wondered if it was Riley, but she didn't think her rival was that cruel. You didn't realize that Maya was having an emotional breakdown right behind you. You were desperately trying to remember who the culprit was. You remembered it was some rich kid whose family was about to go bankrupt. He was one of Riley's loser friends. He had set up an illegal gambling ring and was acting as the house. He needed to win big to save his family's business. He had bet everything he had left on Riley winning the race. He had broken into Maya's garage and sabotaged her bike to make sure she lost the race. Maya tried to stay calm, but she was grinding her teeth in anger. She thought to herself that gamblers really were the worst. She knew that she had enough evidence to put him away for a long time between the illegal gambling and the sabotage. She was already planning out her report to the police. She also wanted to make sure she rubbed it in Riley's face once the guy was arrested. You remembered that Riley eventually found out what had happened and felt terrible about it. You thought about how Riley had stayed by Maya's side even after the family went bankrupt. She had even offered to take care of Maya for the rest of her life. She blamed herself for everything because she was the one who suggested the race in the first place. You thought it was a shame your sister was so incredibly stubborn. She had turned Riley down without even thinking about it. Maya rolled her eyes as she listened to your dramatic thoughts. She decided she wouldn't mock Riley since she actually had a heart. She was actually quite proud of herself for being so forgiving. You suddenly had an idea and asked Maya if she could show your garage. You told her you had never seen a real bike before and begged her to show you. You knew you couldn't tell her the truth, so you decided to take matters into your own hands. You needed to find her garage and figure out which bike she was going to use for the race. You planned to find an excuse to leave so you could check the tire models. Your plan was to buy some sleeping pills to knock her out so you could change the tire without her knowing. You figured you could drug her during lunch and then swap the tires while she was unconscious. You were incredibly proud of your plan and thought it was perfect. The only issue was that you had never actually worked on a motorcycle before. Still, you figured you could learn on the fly. You thought it would be just like fixing a bicycle, which made Maya absolutely furious. You called her name again, and she eventually agreed, but told you to wait for a moment. She ran into another room and did something on her phone before coming back out with a massive toolbox. She gave you a suspicious smile and offered to give you a lesson on motorcycle maintenance. She offered to show you exactly how to take the entire bike apart and put it back together. This completely ruined your plan, and you nervously asked if it would be too much trouble for her. She told you it was no trouble at all and that she had already ordered new parts for the bike. She thought to herself that your sudden interest in her hobby was very suspicious. She told you to just sit back and watch. She decided she would handle the heavy lifting herself. The parts arrived less than an hour later. She led you out to the garage with her tools and the new tires. The garage door opened to reveal a massive collection of motorcycles in every color imaginable. She pointed to a bright red bike and told you that was the one she was using for the race. You were impressed by how cool the bike looked and couldn't help but compliment it. She was incredibly proud of the bike and called it her masterpiece. She had only planned to swap the tires, but she ended up giving you a full lecture. She was surprised to see that you were actually paying close attention to what she was saying. She got excited and started explaining every single part of the bike to you in great detail. When she finally got to the tires, she didn't hold anything back. She swapped the tires out right in front of you with professional skill. She then moved the old tire aside and used a knife to cut open the inner tube. You had no idea what she was doing and assumed it was just part of the maintenance process. You both watched intently as she reached inside the tire and found a small, round object. Maya's eyes narrowed in shock. Hearing about the sabotage was one thing, but actually finding the proof herself was a completely different story. She felt a chill run down her spine as she thought about the future where she had lost the use of her legs. Real strength isn't about handling everything on your own. It is about being able to turn to your family and knowing that they will always have your back.